What you're looking at here is the back of my 1992 Acura Legend. I've had this car for 17 years and it's got about 243,000 miles on it, but I still drive it every day because mechanically it's in excellent condition. What I've done over the last couple years is install some factory upgrades on this car, and one of the upgrades that I did about a year ago was to install a spoiler on the trunk lid. As you can see, the spoiler uses LEDs for the brake lamp, whereas the original high mount brake light up in the window used a standard automotive bulb. Since the LEDs draw a lot less current than a standard automotive bulb, what you're supposed to do on the 1992 Acura Legend when you add a spoiler is to replace the relay that looks like this in the trunk with one that's designed to be used with the spoiler. If you don't replace that relay in the trunk with one that's designed to be used with the factory spoiler, this is what happens. As you can see, when I stepped on the brake pedal, that brake warning lamp came on, and then that stays on for the rest of your drive. It's pretty annoying. So what I'm going to do to compensate for the lack of that special relay is to install one of these 50-watt 6-ohm resistors in the trunk. And I got these on eBay. A set of 4 of these is about $10. Here's a 27-watt bulb that I had installed in the high brake mount lamp. And I'm not going to go into a deep discussion on how I calculated which resistor I would need, but I used Ohm's law and came up with around 6 ohms as the proper resistor size. And since the bulb is 27 watts, I figured a 50-watt resistor should do it. Okay, so here are all the tools and materials I'm going to be using on this project. I've got a soldering iron there, 60/40 rosin core solder, tip cleaner for the soldering iron, heat gun, heat shrink tubing, a couple wire stripper and cutter tools, multimeter. This is not an absolute must, but I'll be using it to check the resistance of the resistor to make sure that it's 6 ohms, 6 ohm resistor, electrical tape, drill with a 1/8 inch drill bit, side cutters, Phillips head screwdriver, heatsink compound, a couple machine screws. Those are number 6 screws that are about 3/8 of an inch long, and then this is just a little screw gun that I have. So before I start the installation, the one thing I wanted to do was confirm that this resistor is actually 6 ohms. So I've got my multimeter hooked up there with the black probe on one end of the resistor and the red probe on the other end, and as you can see, it's about 6.4 ohms. Here's a spoiler wire here, and this is the connector on the brake lamp circuit. That's the old connector right there for the high mount brake lamp. Okay, so the next thing to do was to take the cover off the 2 wires and also to determine where I'm going to mount the resistor. And I'm going to put the resistor right in this area here. Okay, before I went too far in this, the next thing I did was to disconnect the negative battery cable since I'm working on an electrical circuit here. Now what I'm going to do next is cut the wires, and I'm going to cut these wires not too close to the connector and not too close to the hole here, so kind of in the middle right there. If your wiring is in a cramped location, you may not have the option that I have here of cutting the wire, and so you may have to use one of these splice connectors here. I don't really like using these very much, but that is an option also. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do, I disconnected this connector there. I'm just going to take off probably about 3/4 of an inch of wire sheathing here. And this is 18 gauge, so it should come right off like that. Expose that wire underneath there. Do the same thing to the other one. Okay, so as you can see, I've stripped off some of the sheathing on those wires that are up there inside the trunk. And then I've got the resistor and the one wire for the connector. I've just braided them together. And I'll do the same thing on this one, but I'm going to do that later after I get this first set of wires soldered up. So what I've done there is I've put a couple pieces of heat shrink tubing right up in here, and I've put a little black tape on the end of those to hold them up out of the way so I can solder these wires. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to solder the black wires together, and how I'm going to do that is I'm going to, as you can see right there, it makes an X, and then I'll just twist the wires around each other so it'll go kind of like this, where they'll wrap around each other. So I'll do that, and then I'll start soldering. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and solder this up now. Got a nice hot iron with a clean tip. I'll put a little solder on the tip here. Tin it a little bit. And then I'm going to go ahead and place it up against here. A good flow there of solder. Okay, so I let the joint cool, and then I've slid the heat shrink tubing down over the joint. I've also taken the heat shrink tubing off this wire here, because when I apply heat with the heat gun to this joint here, I don't want to have this heat shrink tubing over here, which is in close proximity, start to shrink also. And what I'll do now is just take the heat gun and apply some heat on a low setting. So this wire is finished, got the heat shrink tubing on there, and I'm going to move on to the other wire. Okay, so the next thing to do is to mount the resistor, and what I've done here is place the resistor against the bottom of this shelf and marked a couple spots using the tip of the drill bit that I'll be using. There's one spot right there and one right here. And then what I'll do is take this center punch here, this tool here, and make those marks a little more prominent so that the drill bit doesn't walk on me while I'm trying to drill in those two spots. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and drill my 2 holes now. Make sure this is nice and plumb here. Okay, so I've got my 2 holes drilled right there and right there. The next thing I'm going to do is mount the resistor. Before I do that though, I want to apply some heatsink compound to the back of this resistor because it gets extremely hot. And by applying the heatsink compound, that'll help to fill in the void between the resistor and this metal so that it can dissipate the heat a little bit better. Okay, so I've got the resistor on the bottom of this metal shelf here. And I've got one screw in part way, and I'm going to put the second screw in now, and then I'll tighten them both down after I get everything aligned. Okay, so as you can see, the resistor's on there, and what I'm going to do now is just, now that I've got pretty good squeeze out and all the heatsink compound is squeezing out of the back of the resistor, is just take a cloth and just wipe it off. Okay, so I finished the installation here. That looks really good. And what I'm going to do next is put this plastic back on. Okay, so this is all finished now. What I'm going to do is test it out. So the first test I'm going to do is just to make sure that the spoiler light is still working. And the last and final test is to make sure the brake lamp warning doesn't show up on the dash when I press the brake pedal. So let's give it a try. So as you saw there, no warning light, so I would call this a success. Thanks for watching.